Yeah!
Good shot, Eddie, good shot.
Let's go, baby.
What's up, guys? I have a big tournament weekend coming up with the Fight Night National Championships in Las Vegas, which means it's time to build a championship-worthy Hi-capa. I'm going to be doing a full assembly with aftermarket parts from start to finish, but this guide will apply to almost any Hi-capa or 1911 if you're looking for assembly or upgrade instructions. Every part used in this build is either made by or sold by my sponsor, Hicapa Customs, who sent me everything I needed to make this happen. For those new to building or upgrading Hi-capas, make sure yours is Tokyo Marui compatible before sourcing parts, as that is the standard and compatibility cannot be guaranteed with other brands. We're about to jump into the build, but first I want to thank my patrons and channel members for funding my trip to Vegas, and especially these top contributors right here. Thanks, guys. First off, I want to talk about the new Hicapa Hyperslide and the V2 competition frame I'm using for this build. Unlike my earlier builds, these versions slide right on out of the box and don't need any break-in or work to be super smooth, which takes a lot of the hard work out of the process. Starting with the frame assembly, you're going to need a firing pin, disconnector, valve knocker, sear, hammer, and strut along with the appropriate springs. I'm going to install the strut into the hammer now so I can drop everything into the frame in one go. This is the Hicapa Hive Hammer in the new improved rainbow finish, which is much more durable and looks way better than the previous rainbow finish. The strut is connected to the hammer with a pin pressed into this hole. Make sure the bend on the strut is facing inward and either tap or press the pin in. Be careful not to use too much force, as you don't want to bend the wings or hurt the hammer's feelings. I like to use vice grips to squeeze the pin in because I am very strong and very lazy. But this can leave tool marks if you aren't careful. Next, we unscrew the side panel from the frame and then unscrew the chassis from the side panel. For the side panel assembly, we're going to need a firing pin and the spring to go with it. For the moving internal parts, I'm going to use the medium weight lube from Waldo Customs. Add a small drop into the firing pin channel and drop the spring. The firing pin will then depress the spring and seat right in. Next, I will slot in the chassis and screw it down with some blue thread lock. After tightening, make sure the firing pin is moving freely and we will move on to the chassis. For this, we're going to need a valve knocker and a valve knocker spring. Drop the spring onto the post with the hook facing the left side and hold the spring to the chassis as you slot the valve knocker here. You can function test this by pressing the knocker forward and then pressing the firing pin. But make sure to hold the spring or you'll launch parts into orbit. Like the firing pin, the valve knocker should move freely as well. For the next step, we'll need a disconnector, sear, and a completed hammer assembly. I like to put a drop of lube inside the frame so the disconnector doesn't get thirsty, and then we slide that little guy in right here. Next, we take the sear and slot it over the disconnector, pointy side up. Give your hammer a small sip of lube and a massage before resting it on top of the sear for a nap. The last step for the frame is to replace the side panel and screw it back down with some more blue thread lock. Next, I'm going to assemble the grips, starting with the trigger and trigger bar. The trigger assembly is straightforward, as you just slot the end of the bar into the trigger, but in my case I had to slightly file the inside of my trigger slot as it was a little too tight. Then we press it with a pin just like we did with the hammer. Slip the trigger assembly into the grip and make sure it slides freely, as some grips have extra flash material that may need to be filed. Make sure the trigger is fully forward and drop the magazine release stem using a small screwdriver to engage the locking spring. This particular grip came with its own release button, which screws in on the other side. The grip is attached to the frame with 2 side screws and a third smaller screw through the top of the frame if you're feeling adventurous. To install the rear safety, make sure your hammer is up and then slot the safety over the strut while making sure to line up the holes on the side. Before moving to the side safeties, we need to install the detents to hold them in place. Give the small hole near the firing pin a sip and start with the smaller detent, followed by the spring, and then the detent she said not to worry about. Make sure the detent she told you not to worry about moves freely, and then prepare to cross through the 7 circles of hell if you haven't already launched the spring and detent across the room never to be found again. If you want a right side safety, because it is optional, slide it through the frame and grip safety while meditating on the events to come. Before installing the left side safety, make sure to depress the firing pin, which will reset the valve knocker. Slot the left side safety through the frame and the rear safety like before, but keep a finger on the back of the frame to catch the missile you're about to launch. Use a thin tool to depress the detent she told you not to worry about, while simultaneously pressing the side safeties together and moving your tool out of the way to snap the safeties in place. Once the detent is locked in, press both side safeties down at the same time to complete the QuickTime event and defeat the final boss. If you're using Hicapa side safeties, install the locking screw seen here with blue thread lock. Before we can install the Sear spring, we need to disassemble another missile. The hammer spring cap is held in under pressure by this little pin, which slides out with a small tool. Make sure to catch the missile upon launch, or you will be buying a new hammer housing, as these pins are not sold separately. Using the Cow power regulator kit, I start with the light spring, both end caps, and 2 copper spacers. Drop the parts into the housing and press the pin while also pushing the top cap down to reload the missile. Later you can test your trigger for issues and determine if more hammer strength is needed. After testing my build, I switched out the light spring for the heavy spring to resolve a hammer issue you'll see later. The final step for the lower is to install the final boss's little brother, the Sear spring. While holding up the hammer strut, slot the Sear spring into the grip while making sure the middle and right forks are on top of the Sear and disconnector. The easiest way for me to do it is by slanting it at an angle and rotating it down. I wasn't able to record it clearly on camera, but here are multiple angles for you to see how it sits. Continue holding down the mini boss while you drop the hammer strut and rear safety, which will keep it in place while you plug the hammer housing back in like this. If you're using a mag weld, put it in place while continuing to hold the hammer housing down and slide the retaining pin through the holes. The lower is now complete and you can test your trigger for any issues. In my case, there wasn't enough hammer spring strength, which made my hammer lazy and drop inconsistently. After switching to the heavy spring, the hammer started hammering. Moving on to the upper, I'm going to be using the Hicapa Hyper Slide, but first I'm going to install the fibers in my front and rear sights since I've gotten a lot of requests for that. Installing fibers is simple, but you can also mess it up very quick, so be careful. I'm going to start by inserting the fiber into the sight and leaving a little slack because we need to torch this little guy. When melting the fiber, less is more, so hit it a little bit at a time. If you don't have a torch, a lighter will work too. With the fiber still in the sight, clip the tail off the other end, leaving a little bit of slack like before, and hit it with the torch again. To install the front sight, I give the slide a small sip of glue and slide the sight in. After it's centered, I give it a couple more sips and let it rest until the glue is set. Gel super glue works best here. For the rear sight fibers, the process is the same as the front and I completed it off camera. We'll install the rear sight later. For the blowback housing, I'm using the Hicapa Turbo, which has an additional O-ring for extra consistency. I'm pairing this with an Hicapa nozzle, which may or may not be for sale yet depending on when you see this video. Until these are for sale, I recommend the stock Marui nozzle until it breaks, followed by the Airsoft Masterpiece Edge nozzle. For this nozzle, I'm also going to use a Cow valve spring for some extra power, along with an aluminum valve blocker from Hicapa to help me reach a higher FPS since the weather is getting colder. Your nozzle will come with this little magician right here who will vanish before your eyes and never be seen again, so don't let him see the carpet. To assemble the nozzle, drop the valve spring in, followed by the valve and valve blocker. The blocker has a threaded hole on top, which you need to line up with the hole on the top of the nozzle. Proceed to finger the nozzle and hold the valve blocker in place while you screw in the magician, which completes the assembly. If installed correctly, the valve will move smoothly and snap back into place. The turbo comes with 3 different O-ring sizes to match to your nozzle, so make sure to test each size to find the best fit while still allowing the nozzle to move freely. This size is a bit tight, but I'm going to test it for now. Don't forget to give your O-rings a sip, they're always thirsty. With both of the O-rings on, I'm going to screw the cylinder head to the blowback housing with blue thread lock. Make sure this one is tight or you're going to spend a lot of time someday trying to figure out what's wrong with your Hicapa when it comes loose. After that, you can slide your nozzle in and check the resistance against the O-rings. Ideally, you want as little resistance as possible while still maintaining a full seal with the nozzle. The final step in the blowback housing is the nozzle return spring. For this build, I'm using the Battle Flare 180% because it's all I have right now, but I do prefer the AIP 140 since I don't short stroke too hard. To install the blowback housing, you just slot it into the rear of the slide, but these 180% nozzle springs are kind of tricky, so I'm going to have to do what's called a pro gamer move. I'm going to insert the nozzle spring while the blowback housing is already inside the slide, and then I'm going to drop it down just enough to slide the rear side over it. Now I can screw the blowback housing and rear sight into the slide. You can see the nozzle is snappy while returning because of the 180% spring, but it stopped short due to the O-rings being too thick. While testing, I got around 10 more FPS with the thicker O-rings, but I later stepped down to a smaller size O-ring to avoid possible feeding and consistency issues. For the barrel setup, I'm using the LCapa Tornado Outer, TTI Infinity Hopup, PDI 601 barrel, and the LCapa Green bucking. To install the bucking, line up the notch with the channel on the underside of the barrel and just slide it on. This particular Hopup is a one-piece design, so installation is going to be different from just about every other Hopup. The entire barrel slides through and presses into place, which I used a second barrel to help me do. I then lock the barrel into place with this barrel clip, which is followed by a set screw to make sure it doesn't fall out. After that, I'm going to slide the barrel and Hopup into the outer barrel, and then slide the outer barrel into the slide. For the guide rod and plug, I'm using the new Next Speed 5.1 set along with LCapa short strokes and an AIP 120% recoil spring. Be careful when compressing the guide plug because you can very easily that hit me in the face. Launch a missile. This guide rod has a cool feature that helps with installation, but I did have it lock itself on me once, so I'm probably going to replace it just to be safe. To install the guide rod, just slot it against the Hopup and release tension on the guide plug. You might have noticed the 1911 style guide is now missing, and that's because the Next Speed guide rod does not have the slot for it. After installing the guide rod, the upper is now complete and we can slide it onto the lower. Make sure to give the rails a little sip, and on it goes. Some Hopups are a little tight out of the box and need a little spank to seat properly. To finish off the build, I'm using an AIP thumb rest, which takes the place of a standard slide release. With the last piece installed, we can finally test fire. So hopefully this video was helpful for building or upgrading your Hicapa. If you guys have any more questions or if this video did help you, go ahead and let me know down in the comments, and thanks for watching my channel.